Photography is a happy marriage between technology and art. There has to be a nice little blend of both in order for things to work. And over the course of the next few videos, we're going to talk about both sides of this coin. But for now, let's just talk about the technical side. Now, I'm going to assume that everybody watching this has already got some kind of basic understanding of, I guess, the exposure triangle, or at least using your camera in manual mode. But for the sake of those that are maybe a little less experienced, we're going to cover a few specific things. There are three main functions in your camera that control exposure. The combination of these three things is known as the exposure triangle. Now, the interesting thing about this trifecta is that each one of these settings directly affects the others. So anytime one of them is lacking, the other two have to adjust in order to compensate for it. Now, learning how to balance these settings, and especially learning the effects that each one provides your image, will help you to create better quality images. Now, the first, and what I argue to be the most important of these three settings, is called the aperture. Now, the aperture isn't actually in your camera, it's in your lens, and it serves the purpose of controlling the intensity of light that is contacting your sensor. Your aperture is very much like the pupil or the iris in your eye, which I'm really not even sure if those things are the same thing. But your aperture is made up of a series of blades that kind of go around in a circle. And so in the middle of that circle is a hole. And as those blades open or close together, that hole gets larger or smaller. Imagine it very much like a faucet and you're filling up a glass. So a small aperture is like having a small opening and just letting in a little bit of light or a little bit of water. And a large aperture is like just cranking open a fire hydrant and blasting as much light through there as you possibly can. A tricky thing to remember about aperture is that a smaller number, like say f2.8, actually indicates a larger opening. And a larger number, like f16, inversely indicates a smaller opening. And this is because aperture is actually written as a fraction. So when I say something like increase or open your aperture, remember that that means to make it a smaller number, like f2.8, f1.8 and such. And if I say to close your aperture or to decrease your aperture, that means to make it a larger number, like f16, f18, f22. So that's how your aperture works, but what kind of effect does it actually give your image? Well, your aperture controls an effect called depth of field. And what depth of field is essentially how much of the image is in focus. So if you increase your depth of field, more of your image is going to be in focus. And if you decrease your depth of field, less of your image will be in focus. Now, this is an incredibly important function of your camera system. Controlling your depth of field will allow you to isolate or expound upon your subject. Now, we'll cover this in more detail when we talk about composition, but for now, I'll at least say that this is probably, at least what I consider, to be the most important element to modern landscape photography. Now, another thing to remember about your lens is that there's an area there that's known as the sweet spot. And this is going to be the point in your lens where your images are actually going to turn out to be the sharpest. And usually that's right around f7.1 or f8. That kind of midsection in your aperture is going to turn out the sharpest in your images. And inversely, if your lens has a sweet spot, it's probably got a sour spot too, except I don't think I've ever heard anybody call it that. And so if you have your lens as wide open as possible, like f1.8, or even as closed as possible, like f22, those two apertures are going to actually produce less sharp images, and that's because they're really working those optics. In a small aperture like f22, you're going to get into what's called diffraction, and in a large aperture like 1.8, you're just going to lose a little bit of that sharpness that you get if you were using, say, f8 or f7.1. Now, the second component to the exposure triangle is shutter speed. And shutter speed is a little more straightforward. I mean, all that is how fast your shutter opens and closes. Seems pretty easy, right? But there's actually a lot more that goes into that. Now, let's say you want to photograph a fast-moving subject like a waterfall or a river, or maybe something's blowing in the wind and the leaves are moving, and you want to freeze that motion. You want to capture every little drop of water in midair as if it were just frozen in time. Well, in order to do that, you're going to need to use a fast shutter speed. So now let's say you're in that same place, you're photographing that same waterfall, but instead of freezing every little drop of water in midair, you want to watch it go by and you want to blur that motion as it moves in front of your camera. In order to do that, you're going to need to use a longer shutter speed. And doing that will just give your image a totally different look and feel rather than using a fast shutter speed. And it always just depends on the image itself. But now this is going to create a bit of a problem. You see, the longer you leave your shutter open, the more light is going to bombard your sensor and it's going to end up overexposing your image. So you have to use your other two settings, the other two functions in the exposure triangle, to compensate for this. And that brings us to the last component of the exposure triangle, which is ISO. Now ISO stands for International Standards Organization, which really doesn't have anything to do with anything, but I mean, what do I know? They could have just called it light sensitivity, but no, we call it ISO. And what ISO does is it makes your sensor more sensitive to light. So in other words, by increasing your camera's ISO, you're making the sensor more capable of picking up smaller amounts of light. Now, the adverse effect of this, though, is that as you put more energy into that sensor, as you turn up that ISO higher, you're going to start to produce something called noise or grain, which is a type of image distortion. And it's really exactly as it sounds. It looks like your image is being printed on sandpaper, kind of grainy. So the higher the ISO, the more noise, grain, and distortion you're going to find in your image. The lower the ISO, the better image quality you're going to have. So typically for landscape photos, you want to shoot as low at ISO as possible. Again, as you turn up that ISO, you're going to put more energy into your sensor and you're going to produce a little bit more grain and distortion. And the higher and higher you go, the more of that distortion you're going to get. Full frame cameras tend to perform better at high ISO than crop frame cameras do. And this is typically because a full frame camera has a larger sensor. So the megapixels in that sensor, they're not usually crammed in there as tight as they are in a crop frame. So when you energize them, you turn up that high ISO, they don't get so aggravated with each other. They have a little bit more room to get energized. And now is where you start to see all three of these components, these members of the exposure triangle. Now we get to see them all work together. Okay, so let's say that you want to photograph a large, vast scene. And so typically for that, you probably want as much of this scene to be in focus as possible. And so what are you going to do? You're going to increase your depth of field. And remember that you do by decreasing your aperture and making it a larger number. So say we want to turn it down to f16, we're going to make that hole in the aperture smaller, and so we increase that depth of field and get more of that image in focus. But now by doing so, we've decreased that hole in the lens, less light is coming in. And so in order to get our camera to get enough light to get a proper exposure, we're now going to have to lengthen the time that our shutter is left open. And we want our ISO to be nice and low for this image, so we're just going to set it at ISO 100, which is typically best. I try to keep it right around there. So let's say we still want to photograph the same scene, but maybe for right now, we'll say the conditions aren't actually what they are now. Let's say, just pretend it's a little bit darker than it actually is. So we want to photograph this scene and get that depth of field front to back as far as possible. So we close our aperture and we get a tiny little hole in there, and now we're not letting in very much light. And so what do? We increase our shutter speed, but because it's so dark, we have to increase our shutter speed for a longer time. And maybe that time is now too long. Now we can see the little leaves and the grass and the things moving in our image that we don't want to see them moving. And so we need to increase our ISO. And remember, the higher you turn up your ISO, the more grain and noise you're going to see in your image. So be conscious of that. You want to turn it up just enough so that you can speed up your shutter speed. Again, just enough so that you don't see that movement in your image. Now the main thing we're trying to get you to do here is just get your camera out of auto mode. Stop using the automatic presets, stop using automatic mode, and start manipulating these three settings on your own. Use manual mode, use aperture priority mode. The main thing, you just need to start using the exposure triangle and taking control of it. By doing so, you can now control the effect that these things give to your image. And remember also though, that there isn't just one equation. That say we come here, we come at a different time of day, I'm going to use a different shutter speed, I'm going to use a different aperture, I'm going to use a different ISO. It all depends on your subject, on the light especially, on a number of different things. There is never just one equation to photograph the stars, to photograph a waterfall, to photograph mountains, whatever it might be. Just be creative, play around with these settings, get used to them, get used to your camera, and you will be amazed at the things that you can accomplish.
Subscribe to this channel and find me on themountain.com.
Okay, you ready? Are you recording?
Yes.
Okay. Just like some kind of like action or something. Mosquitoes! Ready? Yes. No! Bam! That's it.